Icarus Uprising is a video game for the Nintendo 3DS released in 2012. The game was developed by Project Sora, which was a development team literally formed for the sole purpose of developing said game. Project Sora was headed by Masahiro Sakurai, of course, and he ended up forming his own team of mostly familiar people who he had worked with on Smash games in the past. Taking that fact into account, it's fairly obvious that this game has a lot of talent behind it. For example, Yasunori Mitsuda, who composed the soundtrack of Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross, as well as Motoi Sakuraba, who composed the soundtracks of games such as Valkyrie Profile, Golden Sun, and Dark Souls, are just two of the many people who worked on Uprising's soundtrack. In addition to having an excellent crew of people to work on it, Uprising was also specifically developed to take advantage of, or at least make some use of, all of the 3DS's features. An ambitious project with an obviously high budget, Sakurai specifically requested Nintendo to create. Surely this had to end up being a quality title, possibly one of the best games in the 3DS library when all is said and done. At this point, you may be wondering why I'm blowing the game up so fervently, and the answer is quite simple, really. At the end of the day, Kid Icarus Uprising is a mixed bag, full of good and bad stuff. I'll start with the voice acting and writing, as they're pretty important aspects for this game in particular. Pit and Palutena will always be talking throughout the duration of flying sections. Then a funny, likable villain will show up and start chatting with them. Obviously, not every single mission is the same, but they all follow this general structure. Sometimes the villain won't show up until the land section, but I digress. It's a very structured and rigid kind of style that this game employs, which is probably part of the reason why it's so surprising that the VA work is, frankly, fantastic. Palutena, Pit, Veridi, Hades, Phosphora, they're all incredibly charming and well-realized characters, mostly due to the excellent voice work. And keep in mind, I'm actually talking about the English dub here. You don't often get such solid performances in Japanese to English video game dubs, but you definitely get it here. Moving on to gameplay, the air sections are almost always very fun, if not a bit repetitive. This is a good example of a game which you almost need to play with voices in a language you actually know, as all the dialogue is happening while you're moving around with the circle pad and aiming with the stylus. I know that was a pretty poor attempt to transition into a different subject, but cut me some slack here. The controls for the air sections are really quite nice. Along with aiming with the stylus is honestly the optimal way of playing such a game, rather than a gimmick. Everything controls very nicely until you get to the dreaded land sections. Playing as Pit on the ground feels a bit like controlling Kirby without a vehicle in Kirby Air Ride. It's rather clunky. Unfortunately, you end up fighting most bosses during these land sections, and most of the fights just end up feeling a bit bland, lazily produced. Frankly, it seems pretty likely that the developers knew players wouldn't want to struggle with the clunky land controls, and made the bosses fairly simple in response. Also, somehow I haven't mentioned that there's a fun little gambling difficulty system. You bet your hearts, which act as the main currency of the game, and depending on how high you set the difficulty level, you'll earn hearts accordingly. It's actually a pretty innovative and unique system, one I can't help but applaud. It's an interesting way to make players try harder difficulties and in turn probably enjoy themselves more. I guess what I'd like to posit as my final thought would be that this game is full of interesting, fun ideas. It's also very fun to play for the most part. I think this is definitely one of Sakurai's best efforts, and although part of what makes it so interesting is the fact that it was designed around the hardware of the 3DS, I'd love to see a sequel.